My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Today, guest of honor, man, my dear publisher, Gary Groth, Fantagraphics, responsible for some of the most important comic titles in my lifetime and probably yours, man. Rattle off some names.
Love and Rockets, 8-Ball, Hate, The Comics Journal,
Acme Novelty Library, and we can't forget 50 issues of Critters. Gary Groth, man, thanks for joining.
Glad to be here. Can't wait for your barrage of questions.
Well, off the bat, man, who do we blame? Is it you or Kim Thompson, who was the spearhead of the aforementioned Critters comic?
That was entirely Kim.
Why'd I think you were going to say that?
I didn't even, honestly, I didn't even read it. I'll tell you, I had an embarrassing moment because I had my son, and when my son was, I don't know, 3 or 4 or something like that, I was reading to him. I started reading Usagi to him. I don't know if Stan knows this, but we published Critters in like 80, you would know this, right? At 86?
86 is the magical year.
So this was the first time I read Usagi. And I mean, I just thought, it's this goofy samurai rabbit stuff. It's in Critters. I wasn't that interested in it. I mean, I was much more militant in my tastes then. Not much more militant than I am now, but somewhat more. And so I read Usagi to him for the first time, and I was fucking blown away. I mean, this is just masterful cartooning. And it was just the context that was off-putting to me, even though it was our own context, but it was the context we created. But, so I was reading Usagi to my kid, for the first time and enjoying it with him for the first time. We're both enjoying it.
So my first Fantagraphics comic was a Critters that my uncle gave to me, and I was a little boy at the time, and even then I was perplexed because I was like, it doesn't seem nice. Like I'm a little boy, I should be susceptible to just like fun little animal comics and stuff, but I'm like, I don't know, this seems like big people animal comics or something.
Yeah, there was some weird sex. I mean, Joshua Quagmire. He did some weird shit in there.
And Usagi would be the diamond in the rough, the outlier.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I was just joking about talking about Critters for 5 hours, man. We should launch into some other stuff.
Having seen your broadcast, I believe you could do that though.
Yeah, man, this is the home of the 5-hour, or was it 7-hour Comics Journal coverage on one issue.
Multi-episode, yeah, a mini-series on one issue of the Comics Journal.
Gary, let's get this out the way real quick, man. You came through on the other side of COVID, man.
Yeah. I don't want to make a big deal of it. I'd like to be able to say that I stared death in the face, and but it was relatively mild. It was just like a harsh flu. I got tested March 18th. I knew I had it. I had a fever. I started feeling stuffed up. I just started feeling sluggish. I almost never get a fever, and I had a fever. I started getting a fever, and for the first time in a long time, I got a thermometer out and took my temperature, and it was up. And I just knew I had it, so I called up, and they told me to get in immediately because I was in the high-risk category, and I was tested immediately. And it took them a week to actually give me the results, but I figured I had it. But I got through it. It was like 2 weeks, and then you have to wait 72 hours after your symptoms are gone. So it was 2 weeks in 3 days, and then I could leave the house and go to a grocery store, but. I stuck by the house, and it was just kind of miserable. I felt like my head was full of concrete, and the fatigue was the worst. I just felt tired all the time, and there'd be 2 times during the day where I'd be reading something, and I would just not be able to keep my eyes open. I would just have to crash. But that was it, and I have asthma, so I was actually worried that it was going to trigger my asthma because it's a respiratory virus. And the first thing I did was take my asthma inhaler and put it next to my bed because I had these nightmares of waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to breathe.
Sure.
Which has happened before. And but that didn't happen. It never hit my lungs. So And I'm actually glad I got it then, early, because if I got it now, I'd be far more terrified. I mean, I think I didn't know as much about it, and I hadn't been bombarded by the media
Right.
as much. So I didn't even know enough to be, as terrified as I possibly should have been. But, I got it done early, got it out of the way.
I do think about, like, okay, so you came through on the other end. Now you could just tiptoe and skip down the sidewalk and no big deal, man. Everybody else is wearing their masks and stuff, but you're all good, right? It's like a bulletproof vest.
Yeah, I'm going out and licking grocery store cart handles, and, having a ball.
Gary, that makes me ask about the future of Fantagraphics. I remember several years ago when Kim Thompson passed, and it seemed like it was a scary moment as a fan, wondering, what happens to this company and what are its future plans. And is that something you are comfortable talking about? I mean, even in terms of retirement, I don't know if that's something that's on your radar yet, but what does that look like?
Yeah. You're talking about the future beyond like 8 weeks, right?
Yes.
Well, we have never been more economically stable than we have in the last 5 years or so. And I can't tell you why that is. I can't explain that. It's just that somehow things have leveled off and we've become much more economically stable. In terms of the future, I see it being very much, we have a mission, and that mission really hasn't changed over 45 years now. That's terrifying to even say that, but and our mission is to produce the best comics that we can. And I see us doing that. I see us changing with technological changes and cultural changes and so on, but that is our core mission, and that's not going to change. So we just have to adapt to economic circumstances and cultural circumstances and technological changes in order to pursue that. A lot of people have been asking me that recently, and they think that the comics market is just this tiny sliver of our business, but no, it's a substantial part of our business. If we didn't have the comics market and comic stores selling our books, we probably wouldn't be here. We need them. They're an important part of our revenue.
So would you say it's like a third, and a third between conventions, direct market, and then booksellers?
No, not at all. Conventions are extremely minor.
Okay.
In fact, the actual profitability of conventions are almost nil.
Well, you bring your entourage.
I need the 12 people and the hotel rooms for each one of us. Once you factor in, this might be a little boring, but once you factor in freighting books in, the cost of the booth space, the cost of employees, the fact that employees who are working at conventions can't be working in the office and doing their jobs there, the actual cost of the books themselves, we're lucky if it's a wash at most conventions, and probably on a per annual basis, it doesn't come out to much more than a wash. There's a PR value in it, there's a marketing value in it, and just getting out there and being out there and seeing people who buy our books and talking to them. There's a value to that, but it's not it's not a strictly economic value. So that if conventions went away, which come to think of it, they have, that wouldn't affect us at all. It's the breakdown is roughly Diamond and the comics market is roughly 30% of our sales, and the other 70% are various book channels. Conventions are just a tiny.
Is online sales any part of that pie? Does that make up very much?
It is. We sell books through our website, and it's a not insignificant amount of money. We're relaunching our website in about 4 weeks, and our goal is to double our e-commerce revenue. We wanted to do this before the pandemic, but now that the pandemic is here, we've realized even more that is something we can control. We can't control whether bookstores can stay open in California or New York, but we can to some extent control our own website and our promotion of that website. So we're going to be beefing that up. It's going to be a brand new, beautifully designed website. Jacob Covey is working on designing it. The navigation is going to be 21st century navigation, and our goal is to double our revenue. So that's going to be significant.
Let's do our first tangent here. You just mentioned Jacob Covey. I'm a huge fan of his design work. I think many of the books that I'm aware he's designed are gorgeous. How did you come across him as a designer, and what were your impressions of that?
Well, he came across us. He, let's see if I'm trying to remember this correctly. He came to us. I hope this is true. He submitted a resume out of the blue. He was working, I think he was working for a shoe manufacturer in Bellevue, which is a suburb of Seattle, Tony suburb of Seattle. And obviously he wanted to do something other than that. And I think he just submitted his resume, and we interviewed him. And I think one of our other designers might have been starting to, making noise about leaving at that time. And I thought he was fantastic. And Kim was a production manager at that point. And Kim and I talked about it, and that's how we hired him. It was just, it was that relatively that easy. But yeah, he is a fantastic designer, and I think he's, when he came on board. And I don't know if you read a piece I wrote about Dale Crane, who was an earlier designer. I wrote a piece about Dale Crane that I threw on Facebook about a week ago. But he did the same thing Dale did, except several levels higher, because it was 20 years later. I think he upped our game single-handedly when he came on board, and he's been here for 12, 13 years now.
I'm hoping to get an interview with him at some point, because I've admired his work for a long time.
And, you absolutely should. I mean, he's very articulate about design, and he's very good about talking about how design interacts with content. And that's one of the things that makes him so good. I mean, he doesn't design something in the abstract apart from the content.
Yeah, he used to blog about some of his design, and it was exactly what you're describing, very articulate in the process and walking through choices that he would make that I found educational.
Down to the typefaces.
Yes. All right, let's go back, resume the distribution stuff. Do you guys do any e-reader stuff with your comics? Is that part of your strategies?
Yeah, sure. I mean, most of our books are available as ebooks, so they're available on Kindle and
Comixology,
Barnes and Noble reader, and they're available on virtually every platform. So that's, if you're asking, how significant a revenue stream that is, it's small and it's plateaued. It plateaued a year or so ago, and I think this is true across publishing. Everyone expected ebooks to keep climbing, and that hasn't happened. But it's like, especially for us, probably less so for Penguin Random House, but especially for us, it's like every revenue stream is important. Our e-commerce right now, even though it's not as great as it was, it's still important. Our mail order 20 years ago was about $2 million a year. And then Amazon came along, and our mail order just dropped every year. But essentially Amazon is taking over that. So we're still selling the same number or possibly more books, but we're doing it through Amazon rather than through our own website. But really every channel that we pursue is important to keep us alive.
It's the same as any individual, the diversity of portfolio.
Yeah, a larger corporation probably ebooks are just an insignificant amount of revenue for them. But for us, everything is important because we play things close to the vest. You probably know that.
I saw you recently on a panel with Steve Jeppe and some other publishers, talking about kind of how things are going to look as we come out of COVID, and hopefully business returns to something. Any expectations, or are you seeing anything that looks like it'll be different in terms of the way Diamond and comic shops operate? Anything new and exciting there?
I don't think there's anything exciting there. No. I mean, I don't see it, I mean, I was speculating in that interview that appeared on TCJ that floppies could go away. But it just depends on whether, the big company, Marvel and DC, think that they're worth it for some reason other than purely economically. I mean, I don't know. I guess they amortize costs of of the eventual collection down the road. There's some tangential reasons they keep doing it, and I guess there's a significant necessity for a lot of comic stores. I mean, most comic stores probably rely on those things, which, I mean, I think it would be important. I think it would be helpful to them if they could get away from that model and rely more on books. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure I see that changing. I mean, the habits of comic fans, I don't really even understand this. Do you guys go to comic stores every week? And
not for a while.
They're shaking their heads. I don't really understand that anymore. I mean, in the 80s, that was the model. I mean, there weren't any graphic novels to speak of. And you had to play that game. I just don't understand, 40-year-old guys collecting Iron Man. I just don't get it. And I think that's what is holding, that whole market together. These middle-aged, mostly guys, buying shitty comics. I don't understand. I don't know.
I feel like it
seems like a sustainable model to me. Not because of the shitty comics, because people love shitty comics, but in that format, I mean, I did a calculation which I wasn't able to use during that talk with Jeppy, but when I bought comics, they were 12 cents. When I was a kid buying comics, they were 12 cents. And I extrapolated from that. I looked at a conversion chart about what the current cost of a comic should be based on inflation, and it should be like $1.10. And instead of that, it's like $3 or $4. So I'm not sure. I mean, and the reason for that is probably because the print runs of comics are about 1/10 of what they were in 1965.
I forget what I was looking at.
Is better, so you can look at that beautiful art.
I was looking at something. I think it was the inflation. Okay, so that Whammo comic from the 50s, that super big giant comic.
Yeah.
I forget what it costs on the cover, but it works out to about $8.
Oh man!
Which is still cheaper than Detective Comics 1000 or Action Comics 1000, which is $10. And this comic, it'll be on the channel one day. We can't fit that on the screen. It's like a 3-foot tall comic.
Yeah, I often think that it seems like such a barrier of entry, especially to a new reader. When I was a kid and would buy comics, I'd buy half a dozen, and some of them were going to be terrible. You just take a chance because they were 75 cents or something that I could afford.
They cost $1 or so. Well, how long ago are you talking about?
Late 80s.
Okay.
$1 a piece, man.
Yeah, $1 a piece. But, I'd go in there with $10 and come out with 5 or 6 comics, and some would just be taking a flyer because they had 3 that I knew I wanted, but I wanted a couple more to look at. And now I can't imagine doing that. Even as an adult, I can't imagine going and just buying, $25 or $30 worth of comics. What would be new comics now? It's a very different. Right. All of it just feels very different. But
it just seems like the readership for that is going to be dwindling over, all the time.
The customers are legacy customers for sure, from the sound of things, from what I see when I hit the comic shop up. Gary, we get a lot of requests. We've been doing these interviews once a week since we've all been sheltering in place and all that. And names come up all the time. You guys should interview this guy. You should interview that guy. One of the names that comes up a bunch is Jim Steranko. Jimmy and I tried to interview him one time or two at a convention, and we got one word in edgewise, and it was the Jim Steranko show. And I remember you lived with the guy for a period of time here in our great state of Pennsylvania. Tell us about Jim Steranko and what was it like to live with him.
And if you don't mind, give us a quick little description of Jim Steranko for anybody watching this that maybe isn't familiar with his history or significance, or how you would describe him in a brief intro.
Well, I'll give you some context. When I was, I don't know how old I was, 15 or 16, I fell under the sway of Steranko. And Steranko has a kind of, he created a kind of myth about himself. And he did this very early on. And I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And I loved his work when he was doing S.H.I.E.L.D. I mean, at the time, it was exciting work. I mean, I'm not sure, I can't see that it's dated well. But at the time, you have to look at the time, and it was, Kirby was the guy who everybody was emulating. You had a lot of, essentially journeyman cartoonists doing the work, and a lot of it was really incredibly good, competent work. But he did bring something fresh into mainstream comics, and I was a big fan of his. And he had this kind of self inflicted gravitas about him, and he had his turtlenecks, and he was a real hipster in a cultural milieu that did not have any hipsters. I mean, they were all like middle-aged guys who were wearing suits and ties at conventions. You go to a convention and everybody, all the professionals, you could tell the professionals from the fans because all the professionals were wearing suits. They all had the thin ties. But he came in, with a turtleneck sweater and, the glasses, and he was a little bit younger than a lot of, he was like 10 or 15 years younger than most of the cartoonists who were working in comics at that time. And you probably know that there was this period of comics where they weren't hiring artists.
Right.
So there was this weird generation gap. And the young artists at that time were people like Bernie Wrightson and Mike Paluda, Barry Windsor Smith, who were coming in around, they came in just a little bit, I think, after, well, probably at the same time Steranko did, or a little bit after. But then they were really young. They were like 23, and Steranko was in his 30s. But then from Steranko to Gil Kane or Joe Kubert, people like that, Kurt Swan, there was like 15 years difference. So there was this perception that he was this youngish hipster, and he did bring in this fresh look. So anyway, I loved his work. I got to know him as a fan. I interviewed him, probably the first and last interview I will have done with him. And I've asked to interview him too. I would actually love to sit down and talk to him. And I've asked him that a few times, and every time I ask him in person, he says sure, and then I call him up, doesn't answer the phone. So I don't know what that's about. But I interviewed him in the fanzine I did when I was like 16 or so, and I got to know him. So at one point, I think I was 19. I had gone through 1 year of college. I entered college when I was 17. So I was either 18 or 19 when Steranko gave me a call, and he asked me if I'd like to work for him. And at the same time, Roy Thomas called me and asked me if I'd like to work at Marvel. And I remember having to choose between the two because it happened within weeks of each other. And I was back from college living with my parents. I might have been living with my dad alone. And I asked his advice, like, what do you think? And at the salary that Roy offered me at Marvel, my father said, you can't live in New York on that salary. That would just be impossible. So then I got back to Roy and I said, my dad said, I'm 19 years old, maybe, 19, I think. And I got back to Roy and I said, my dad says I can't live in New York at this salary. And he says, well, that's true, but we can give you extra work to do, like freelance work we'll pay you for. So then I thought, God, I'll be working for Marvel 8 hours a day, and then I'll be going home and doing freelance work. That sounded, even to my more naive 19-year-old self, it sounded like hell. And Steranko was my hero. And he told me, so the job would be to help him design Preview magazine. Do you know what Preview? You know what Preview is. And that sounded reasonably exciting. And he said, eventually, I could take over designing it. Well, I learned later that would never happen. But that was kind of dangled in front of me. And he said, you would learn a lot working with me, and I thought that was true. So I agreed. So I drove up. I moved up there. He lived in a big townhouse. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Steranko, but and it might be, might get boring. But I moved lock, stock, and barrel. I moved all my stuff up there. I had a small trailer hitched up to my car. I mean, I was moving. So I had a room. Jim lived in a big townhouse in Reading, Pennsylvania. It was a really gorgeous, huge townhouse. So I lived on the ground floor. It was one of those old houses you see in movies where there's if you walk into the front door, there's like a big living room, and then there are these huge sliding doors that enter into, I don't know what, a sitting room, whatever they had back then. I mean, it was an old house. It was like maybe the 1920s. So it was like a sitting room or something, and then after that room is the kitchen. You walked into the kitchen from there. Well, my bedroom was the sitting room, so I was like in the middle of the ground floor of the house. My roommate, the guy who was in the room next to me, was Ken Brusnick, who went on to achieve fame as Howard Chaykin's letterer on American Flag and many other things. Became a really superb letterer. So he lived in the next room, and what was separating us was these big sliding doors. So I had a bed, and I don't remember what else. And then there was a kitchen. Jim lived upstairs, and no one was allowed upstairs. I was thinking about this the other day, and I seem to have this vague memory that I was up there once. I don't know if it's a false memory or not, but I seem to remember a drawing board. It's possible that I was able to go sneak up there once under some pretext or for some reason, but otherwise, Jim would come down. You would not go up. Which makes sense because it's his living quarters. And as I recall at the time, he might have had a girlfriend living with him. So I lived there, and I basically just did what I was told. I would do paste up work on previews, but there wasn't a lot of work to be done. I mean, he didn't give me a lot of work, and so I was idle some of the time. There was so little work that once he came down and he told me, and it was very, it wasn't a collegiate atmosphere. I mean, Ken was a very solitary guy. And, I was 19, I wanted to, and I had a car. Ken did not have a car. So I wanted to go out and do stuff, like at night. I wanted to go out and see movies. I mean, I didn't, I wasn't a carouser. I was, but I did want to go out and do things. And that was kind of frowned upon. I had the clear impression that, you were supposed to be there all the time. And if there was a paste up that needed to be done at 2 a.m, it was time to get up and do it. And Ken seemed to think this was perfectly reasonable, and I couldn't understand that, because I did want a life outside of that, I wanted to date, I wanted to go out. So one time Jim came down, and it was very officious. He would come down, give you instructions, go back up. And one time he came down, and there was a little small room that was, I think, off of Ken's room, and he told me to build shelves, build metal, like those industrial metal shelves. Now, I'm not mechanically inclined, and I didn't go up there to build shelves. But, you have to screw in these shelves together. So I said, well, I don't know if I get, I don't know how to do that. He said, do it. I said, okay. So, I spent like all day or maybe 2 days like building these shelves. I mean, it was a fucking disaster. It looked like the Three Stooges built it. It looked like Larry and Moe, got together and built these shelves. They were like crooked, and you know, they didn't work as shelves, and he came down and looked at it and said, "What the fuck is this?" I don't know. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. So, you know, he's pissed off about it. I'm not sure if Ken might have rebuilt them for me. And I'm trying to organize this in some coherent way. Jim would come down and just yell at us. I don't know what, you know, I think he just wanted his privacy. He wanted a boundary. And I can dig that. He was always dressed, you know, never pulled a hef on us. But he would come down, he would yell at Ken. He would just give Ken unbelievable shit. I mean, demeaning. And, you know, and I was 19. I was kind of a naive kid, you know. I didn't, you know, I was not in the least bit worldly. But he would go down and just ream Ken out. And I was like astonished. And I remember at one time I asked Ken, I said, "Ken, like, why do you put up with this shit? Like, why do you do this?" And he just said, I'll never forget it. He said, "Well, it's better than working construction." So, well, all right, I guess that makes sense. And Ken was a few years older than me, so I think he had worked construction, which I had never done and never would do, you know. So he just made his peace, you know, and once in a while I'd say, "Ken, let's go out and see a movie." And Ken would go, "Well, it was like a big deal, you know." And he'd say, "Well, okay." And then we'd come back, and then Jim would come down and go, "You know, where were you guys?" We went out. And, you know, it was made clear that it was just frowned upon, you know. So it was a weird fucking environment, a very weird and oppressive environment. I wasn't able to use the phone. There was no phone in the downstairs. And so, you know, I said, "You know, Jim, can I use the phone? You have a phone?" "No." He said, if you need to make a phone call, you have to go out and use a phone booth. This is when there were phone booths. There were no cell phones. So I said, okay. So whenever I, you know, had to make a phone call, whenever I had to call my dad or you know, call a friend of mine, I had to walk half a block. He was in the middle of a block. And there was a phone booth on the street corner, on the next street corner. Oh, let me tell you this. This will be a good preface. So I'm walking, the very first night I'm in Reading, and I'm staying at Jim's place. I go out to get something to eat. And I'm walking back to his townhouse, you know, just strolling down the street, minding my own business, and this car starts to drive past me, slows down, and keeps pace with me, you know, which I see him in my peripheral vision, so I kind of know it, but it's kind of weird. And he rolls his window down, and he screams at me, he says, "Are you working tonight?" And I just innocently and accurately say no, because I wasn't, you know. And he says, "Okay," and he pulls off. And I thought, this is a funny question. Like, you know, why would he want to know if I was working tonight? So anyway, I go back. So later on, I have to use a phone booth, and it's at the corner of that street. So I'm using the phone booth probably for the first time. And cars are driving up at the stoplight. It's either a stoplight, I think it's a stoplight. And as I'm on the phone, these cars are honking at me and waving me over. And like, I still don't know what's going on. You know? I'm like this suburban kid. And so, you know, finally I like walk over and go, what do you want? And are you working tonight? So, you know, finally it dawns on me what's happening here. So eventually, every time I go out to use the phone booth, I mean, cars just keep coming up, and I just go, "Not working tonight," you know. And they're all very polite about it. I go, "Okay," and drive off. So it's the first thing I learned working for Steranko.
This is where we post up a handsome 19-year-old Gary Groth photograph to go along with that conversation.
You know, I was always getting hit on by gay guys, and I'm just, you know, for good or ill, I'm not gay, so I was always getting hit on. And yeah, It was. I mean, sometimes I wished I were, because it would have been great. But
what? How does your relationship with that job end? Did it come to some build, or?
It ended abruptly. I just left. I mean, I couldn't take it anymore.
You didn't put your 2 weeks in?
I put in 3 months. I was there for 3 months. But, it was just an unsatisfactory, living condition. There was one time where Jim came down, and he said, "I have some paintings to do." He was doing some paperback paintings. I don't know what they were exactly. It might have been shadow or something like that. And he said he had to paint. And I said, "Okay, that's great." And he said, "You have to leave." And I said, "What do you mean I have to leave?" And he said, "I can't paint with anyone in the house." And I said, "Well, but I'm down here and you're up there. So, I mean, what's the problem?" And he said, "I can't paint with someone in the house." He said, "You have to leave."
And you got to take Ken with you.
Ken's in on it. He's packing up already. He knows the drill. So I said, "Well, leave. Leave to go where? I live here. This is my home. Like, where am I going to go?" And he said, "I don't care. You just have to leave." So I said, "Well, all right." And so I called up my buddy, Mike Catron, who was still in Maryland, attending the University of Maryland. I called him up and I said, "Hey," I said, "you want to drive up here and we'll go to New York for a few days?" He said, "All right." And we didn't know where we were going to stay or anything, but I had a lot of friends in New York just from comics, So he drove up. We drove to New York. I don't know if Howard would remember this, but one of my stops was I think I stayed one night at Howard's.
Howard Chaykin.
So I was like 19, and Howard would be like 24, which to me was much older. He was an established professional.
I feel that way about Jim.
Yeah. So I remember actually, talking to Howard at length in his studio. It was like a really small studio. We might have stayed there one night, and we stayed there a couple of nights. In New York somewhere, I forget where, but we stayed there a few nights. So it was like I was gone for 3 nights, and I went back, drove back, went in the house, and Jim comes down and says, "Haven't been gone long enough." And I said, "Well, I don't know, I've run out of places to go." And he said, "You got to go." So, so I drove down. I think I stayed with Mike for a few more nights. Like he was living in a dorm at the University of Maryland. It was like an apartment dorm or something. So I stayed there for a few nights. And then drove back, and and then it was okay. It was like I was done maybe a week. I mean, it was a week or something he needed. I don't know how many paintings you crank out in a week, but it was it was an accumulation of things.
Sounds like it.
That it just did not sit well with me. Now I talked to Ken about leaving. I said, "What is this about leaving? We have to leave." He said, "Yeah." He'd been there for like 3 years.
Wow.
And he said, "Yeah, Jim. When Jim has to paint, we have to leave." I said, "And that's okay with you? You have to leave?" He said, "Yeah, I can go back to my folks' place for a while." All right. So he was, he was very, very amenable. I'd love to have Ken as an employee. Finally, I mean, I don't know, I couldn't deal with it anymore. It was a seriously oppressive place to be. And I wasn't learning what I wanted to, or what I went there for. It wasn't the job I expected. What you've read previews, right?
Sure.
So I was so naive.
And this is the Jim Steranko previews.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah.
So he would run short capsule reviews of movies. Remember that? Mm-hmm. Like a lot of movies. He would try to cover everything Hollywood was putting out. And so I read these little short reviews, and pursuing one of my many ambitions, unfulfilled ambitions of being a film critic, I went to Jim one day and I said, "Hey, I could write better reviews than these." I don't know who the fuck was writing them, but I could write reviews at least as good and maybe better than these. So how about letting me write reviews? And he said, I don't need you to write reviews. We just take their press releases and rewrite them. And I was like, oh, I guess that's why they're so shitty. And how they're not critical reviews. And I mean, and I remember that surprised me. I was that naive. And he just said, forget about reviews. We're not running reviews. We rewrite their press releases. And I went, okay. And then I thought about that for a while. And is that the kind of magazine I wanted to work on?
We have a lot of different topics that I'd like to cover here. And the best segue I could think of from this list and what you've just said, Gary, is to talk a little bit about the Comics Journal. And more specifically, journalism in the comics industry today. Because I feel like there might not be any. And I wonder...
I'm going to ask if there is any.
Yeah, what are the ramifications of no journalism covering an industry?
I don't know. I asked myself that question. Look, the reason there is no journalism is because no one is willing to pay for journalism. From which I can extrapolate that no one wants journalism. So I'm not sure the question is so much what are the ramifications for not having any journalism, but what are the ramifications for an entire industry not wanting to have any journalism? I mean, what would they do with it if they had it? I'm not sure. There was a period. I don't know. There's so many decades that I can't. I tend to lose track of when things, when these kind of cultural shifts happen. But there was a period where we were fighting in the Comics Journal. We were fighting for the rights of creators to be treated decently and fairly. We were fighting against that whole corporate ethos of treating, our artists like anonymous pegs, square pegs you just put in square holes. And at some point, we won a part of that fight, so the creators did get treated better. Creators did get royalties or some sort of surrogate version of royalties. There was a time when creators could not have an agent. Marvel and DC would not work with an agent. An agent would walk in an office at Marvel and DC and say, I'm agenting, this artist, and they'd say, get out of here. We're not talking to you. So a lot of that changed. And it changed just enough, and this is like the history of capitalism, but it changed just enough to placate creators who were working for these big companies. And Marvel and DC and other companies started treating creators more or less similarly to other, to mainstream publishers. And at that point, something had gone out of the fight because it was less black and white. Like what you were fighting for was less black and white. It was just so onerous, the conditions under which you worked. We're so miserable that you could draw that contrast very starkly, and then the contrast kind of got blurred. So it's like, well, okay, this guy, this particular creator isn't getting as many rights as they created a hierarchy. They created a tier system where some creators were getting, more than other creators, just like the real world. Creators with clout like Neil Gaiman were able to negotiate. And it created a hierarchy just as you see everywhere else. And so everybody became more or less satisfied. So that had a lot to do, I think, with how journalism just slowly ended. There's a certain contentment, in the professional comics industry. I guess I have to admit that I've just, over the years, I became less obsessed with, what you call the industry, Marvel and DC. I just try not to pay attention to them because, I've got to keep my blood pressure down.
Gary, I want to ask, in the 70s when you were when you were doing your fanzines and growing into the Comics Journal, what? Now I know the undergrounds were dying out, but there was still some interesting stuff. But what? You clearly love the form, but what kept you engaged enough to kind of keep some skin in the game? Like I remember in the Harlan Ellison interview, you extolling the virtues of like P. Craig Russell was like the new kid on the block who looked interesting, but a lot of that 70s stuff is kind of dry.
Well, I mean, P. Craig Russell, I think at that time he did a book called Parsifal, which was, I mean, I haven't reread Parsifal in 40 years, but that was the kind of mature content that I was advocating for when I interviewed Ellison in 1979. And it's also one of the very few things that were being done at that time. I mean, there were a handful of things that were, I don't know, Jack Katz's First Kingdom was being done at that time. I mean, and when you're starving, a Snickers bar is what you'll eat, It's like, and we were starving for art at that time. And I've said this before, but I was looking, I had this vague vision of what I thought comics ought to be, or how, or how the artists who were working in comics ought to step up and use the form. Except for the most part, it simply wasn't being done. I mean, you had, Jack Katz, you had Harvey Pekar. He started working in comics in like 74, 75. So you had, One American Splendor a year or something. You had Cerebus, which was not really what I was looking for either, because it was just too derivative of comics. Started off as a Conan parody. So that really wasn't what I was looking for. But again, I mean, you're grasping at straws here. So what kept me going was this abstract vision I had about what comics could be, and the glimmers you saw of what comics could be. I mean, you would look at old newspaper strips like, Little Orphan Annie, or, the work of Cliff Sterrett or Seagar, and I could see that was the kind of work I wanted, with the kind of, the kind of artistic integrity that those artists brought to that particular form. And I guess I wanted to see them moving in a more literary direction. They had their own, like Popeye and Little Nemo and Paulina Pals. They had their own idiom and their beautiful work. But somehow I wanted to see that, brought up into something more contemporary, more mature. But I didn't know what that was. I mean, and I'm not sure I knew what that was until I read Love and Rockets. And I should also say that I saw that in the Undergrounds, but the Undergrounds were their own thing too. I mean, and I, when I was, let me see, what year was this? It would be 70, I think it was 73 or 74. I dealt Undergrounds. I had I actually dealt Underground comics for like a year, 2 years.
I seem to remember you saying that you would, if we look in our 70s Marvels, there's like a little ad here or there on those pages full of ads that would have led to your P.O. box or something?
Yeah, that was for my fanzines, I think.
Okay.
That went up to 72 or 73, yeah. But after that, after I got, let me see, after I entered college, I actually dealt Undergrounds by mail, and I would drive into Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and go to a head shop there and buy bulk copies of Undergrounds. The guy would give me a discount. And then I would take them back to my apartment and, create this mail order department in the living room. And I dealt Undergrounds for a couple of years. And again, that was the direction I wanted to go in. But I was a little too young to experience Undergrounds when they were coming out in their heyday. I caught the tail end of it. I didn't start buying Undergrounds until probably 72. I was just a square kid. I was like this suburban kid, and I didn't, I had to get out of the house and I had to go to college to experience all this stuff. So I saw all these things, but they weren't exactly what I foresaw comics could become. And I think my my analogy was American films versus European films, because I was discovering European films, and this was like a whole new world. And so I was comparing those to American films. And I grew up watching movies, so I grew up watching John Wayne movies and, Westerns and detective movies. My dad would take me to the movies and they're good of their kind. I love Kirk Douglas. But then, you watch European films and they just have entirely different priorities than Hollywood. And it opens your eyes up. And I thought, well, this is the kind of thing comics can do. Like, why can't comics do that? When I saw Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, every time I would go see a foreign film, I'd say, well, why couldn't this be a comic? If the artists were talented enough, he could make this a comic. But everyone was going crazy over Steranko's Outland. And I couldn't understand this.
It sounds like the thing that's falling short is not necessarily the art as much as the story. Is that what you're missing at that time period in comics?
Yes and no. I think the art has to serve the story, and I think the art has to accommodate the depths of the story. So it's not just art. It's that wholeness of vision, where the art and the story and the sensibility all combine into something greater than the sum of its parts. Joe Kubert was a fucking great artist. He was a great draftsman. He could do anything. But then when he applied himself to something serious, it was a disaster. Facts from Sarajevo. Eisner was the same way. Eisner was a superlative artist, and then he got serious. And, from Contract with God on up, I thought all that stuff was considerably less good than his Spirit stuff, because his sensibility was suited to the Spirit. It was suited to doing those great noirish stories and little Damon Runyon character studies. And it wasn't suited to do Isaac Bashevis Singer style stories. I think it was a purely calculated move on his part. He wanted to be that, but he wasn't that. And, you give him some credit for ambition. But, almost any time these artists tried to do something like that, it was a disaster. I'd much rather read Joe Kubert's Tarzan than Joe Kubert's Facts from Sarajevo.
I often think these guys, they push to expand the language or the boundaries of what they can do, but they don't necessarily have the vocabulary once they get there.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm saying. They don't have the vocabulary, but I'm not sure how to put it. They don't have the mind. They just don't have. They have to want. It has to come from within, and maybe that's too glib. I don't think it came from within Eisner. I think it was a calculated career choice that he wanted to be in the forefront of comics. So he very, very, very calculatedly decided he wanted to push the boundaries, and so he was imitating a lot of great Jewish literary fiction at the time, and he couldn't hack it. Gil Kane and I would have these conversations all the time. Every week we would have, we had our standard conversations, and this was one of them. Every week we would talk about this, and I would always be pushing Gil to do something more serious, because I thought he never did anything that was the equivalent of his own intellect. And I think that's true, but I think Gil was also right when he told me that he couldn't do it. He would always push back and said, "That's not me." He would say, "That's not me, my boy. I come from pulp, and that's what I understand." One time I tried to talk him into adapting a John le Carre novel. And I thought that would be kind of a good medium ground, because it's full of people in suits, and he did people in suits great. So there's no superheroics. It's all people in office buildings and, and streets and so on. But it's incredibly intelligent, and it would force him to adapt his approach just enough. I mean, he wouldn't have to, he wouldn't be doing Heart of Darkness, but he could do this. And, it didn't work, but I don't even know where where that all that came from. But all I'm saying, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. They didn't have the vocabulary, but there was something else, they didn't have. I mean, if you just can't take somebody, you can't necessarily take an artist out of his context and what he does well, and move him into something that you want, and have him do it equally as well. Comics all came from pulp, and I mean, comics were just moronic. I mean, they still are, most of them, but I mean, they came from that tradition of just garbage.
There's that Eisner Miller book, the one that we on this program will not compare it to Hitchcock Truffaut in the presence of Gary Groth, but there are at least two pieces that you can pull out from that book where Eisner says that like he wants to make comics. And this is his words. He wants to make comics. The man who lives up on the hill, he says.
Is that what he said?
More than once, at least 2 times in that book. And that speaks to what you're saying, like this calculated maneuver. And it's almost like, if it wasn't the guy who did Spirit for a million years, it's almost like an act of disdain for the medium in a way, where it's like comics is this gutter thing, and I'm trying to, dance and try to pass or something to try to get it into
That was Will's persona, or what he hoped was his persona. And I got the impression in that book that he looked down on what Miller did. In fact, I mean, they got into one amazing little tussle where Will obviously accidentally spoke his true feelings about Miller's work, and Frank actually just took exception. I mean, Frank, who was deferring to him almost all the time, took exception to it. But Will did look down on that work, although he didn't express that often, but he did.
Yeah, I believe that was around the part of the book where they're talking about circulation numbers and how Miller sort of kowtows to lowest common denominator in order to get a bigger audience. Right. He's very happy to have his humble audience.
Gary, you were talking about Gil Kane a minute ago. Can you tell us more about that relationship, how you two, what the relationship is and how that came about, and anything else you want to tell us about Gil Kane? I love anecdotes about these creators. So how did you two, hook up and meet? And
to add to that, we had Howard Chaykin on the channel. We asked him about the art thing. Howard simply said that Gil Kane was a thief. So if you have anything to add to that, any personal feelings about that,
I don't have much to add to it. I can address that for you if you want me to. Well, Gil was somebody I looked up to, and I think primarily because of the interviews he gave. He gave that, you must have read it, he gave that classic interview in Alter Ego, but that was in 1969, I think. And I probably read that after 1969 when I had the wherewithal to, understand some of it. But I came to see Gil, and this would have been in the mid-'70s. We started the Comics Journal in 1976. So that's when I kind of re-entered comics and refamiliarizing myself with the whole comics subculture. And so, I was aware that Gil stood out from all the other professionals by giving these incredibly articulate, contrarian interviews. He would criticize mainstream comics. He would criticize the kinds of comics that he did. And no other artist did that at the time. Alex Toth did it to some extent, but on a much lesser level than Gil did. And Gil's was a coherent and passionate critique of just how abysmal the entirety of mainstream comics were. And I followed that. So I think I called him up one day, and this would have been, I think, in '77. The Comics Journal had been around for 1 year, so we were still finding our footing. But I wanted to interview him early on because he was such a terrifically articulate force. And I called him up and I asked him if I could interview him, and he said yes. And I interviewed him in his hotel room at NewCon in Boston in '77, I think. We just made a date. So I went up to his hotel room with a tape recorder. I interviewed him. We published it in the Comics Journal 37 or 8, something like that. And that, I think that would have been '77. So that's when I introduced myself to Gil and I interviewed him. I would have been 23. Yeah, I would have been 23. And you know, Gil was just so intellectually curious and interesting that I would call him up occasionally because I just wanted to hear him talk. And so I would call him up and I would come up with some excuse to call him up. And then he would forget the excuse and then he would just talk. So I would have these like conversations that lasted an hour, hour and a half. And it would be, you know, mostly me asking him questions or just prodding him to continue talking. And he would just expound. I mean, he would just talk about, you know, he was so disgruntled at the status quo and disgruntled at what he had to do. And he wanted so much to do something else, you know, draw something else. And, that, you know, that he came up with lots of theories about what was going on in comics and expressed his displeasure at what was going on. And so that's how we did. I was in Maryland at that time, so I would call him up every so often and talk to him. And then I moved up to Stamford, Connecticut, and he lived in Westport, Connecticut. And Westport was a haven of cartoonists, mostly newspaper strip cartoonists. Mort Walker was there, and you know, the Mort Walker Factory, and you know, there were a lot of cartoonists who lived in that area. Gil was one of the few comic book artists who lived up there, although Gil did Starhawk, so he was also a newspaper strip artist. Ron Goulart lived up there. So we were a lot closer. It was about a 20-minute drive from where I lived to where Gil lived. So I moved to Connecticut in '78. And since I was nearby, of course, I said, you know, we should get together, you know, And Gil liked to talk to me because we could talk about the same things. And I mean, I was as interested in the things he was interested in as he was. And so we started getting together for dinner, and we just, you know, we just got together all the time and became very close. You know, for the entire time that he and I lived in the same place, and this was in Connecticut and LA, we would get together twice a week for dinner. You know, once during the weeknight and then once on a Friday or Saturday night, like clockwork. And you know, and he became, over that time, you know, he became my closest friend. So we just got as close as, you know, two friends can get.
So was he a thief?
Well, okay, I'll tell you. I had not heard any of those stories or rumors when he was alive. And so I never asked him about it, and he never told me anything about that. Now, he told me, I mean, I knew a lot about what was going on in his life. And I didn't know anything about that then, and I never talked to him about it. That said, it wouldn't surprise me. You know, Gil he never had any money. I mean, he lived in this big house in Westport, and it was a really nice house. He had a great studio there, and I assumed he owned the house, and he didn't. He was renting the house. You know, he had a divorce. He was paying alimony. He never had any money, and he wasn't living high on the hog. I mean, he was living a very modest life. But he never had any money. He was always working paycheck to paycheck. And, you know, sometimes you would get in trouble. Like, I think he had a gallbladder problem when he was doing Starhawks. And he had to go to the hospital. he couldn't draw for a couple of months, and that's when a number of artists took over. I think Chaykin did a couple. I think Ernie Kalan might have done a couple. He just, he called up friends of his who could pinch it, because he couldn't do it himself. He was always late. He was also always late. So he didn't have any cushion. So honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if he did that. I mean, I think he could morally rationalize that to himself, because, I mean, Howard touched on this and dismissed it, but, the companies were either going to give it to fans, or give it to, printers to bribe them in some way, or use it to line bird cages. They were just going to throw it out or whatever. Now, obviously, the moral thing to do would be to steal it and give it to the artist, not steal it and sell it. But, my guess is that, Gil was desperate for money, and he might very well have done that. Like, I don't have any firsthand knowledge that he did that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
What was his reaction to stuff like Love and Rockets?
He loved it. He especially loved Jaime's work. And you know what? He actually loved Mario's work.
I love Mario's work.
Yeah, he loved Mario's stuff. He thought that was absolutely terrific. And Jaime's work, because Gil appreciated good draftsmanship and good drawing, he couldn't fucking believe Jaime's work. And he couldn't believe how old Jaime was. Sometimes Gil would come over to the office a lot in L.A. You know what? And also in Connecticut. And Jaime would mail us his artwork, his original artwork, which we would then photograph, with a big camera. So we had Love and Rockets in the office, every issue. So when Gil would come over, if we got a new issue, and I'd say, Gil, take a look at this. And he would look at it, and I'll never forget, he would look at Jaime's work, and he'd just look at one page after another. And he would just say, son of a bitch. Because he just couldn't believe how well drawn it was, So he, he knew what it was. I mean, he recognized that this was, great work.
What was it like when you receive that package that has the self-published Love and Rockets #1? It has to be like one of those monumental moments in one's life.
Well, it was, but I have to admit that at the time I probably didn't perceive it as monumental as it truly was.
We took a look at it on the channel very recently, and the way that I sort of described it was, that first issue, it's full of potential energy. You know what I mean? Like if these kids could just relax, take a breath, focus, like you could see all of the geniuses there ready to go, but it just needs to be harnessed.
Well, that's what I saw in their self-published one. I mean, it was really great, great, but of course it wasn't as great as it would be 2 years later. Yeah, we got the first issue of 64 pages of art. And, it was exciting. I mean, we were all in our 20s, and we recognized that this was like fresh, new work. But then, it was routine, though. I mean, they would send a new book in every 3 months or whatever it was, and we would get it in. We'd break open the package, and then it was a process. You put it in the stat camera, and you make stats, and and we recognized how great it was, but and we were excited. I mean, it was a thrilling time, because we started publishing Love and Rockets, and then shortly thereafter we started publishing Neat Stuff, and then shortly after we started publishing Lloyd Llewellyn, bang, bang, bang.
I see that little smirk you got when you say that, man, and that is so awesome.
I mean, it's just like we knew what we had, but we didn't know what we had. I mean, it was exciting. It was almost like, this is the way it should be. It should be like, these artists who, who are doing this kind of work, and looking back on it, of course, it was just sort of this monumental sea change.
Gary, a lot of, I guess those artists came to you, through submissions or for review or whatever. How do you keep up with new cartoonists today? It feels like now there are so many incredible cartoonists, and you all continue to publish a lot of new cartoonists. How do you keep up with that?
Well, there in a lot of different ways, and of course, a lot of people in my office keep up with it better than I do. I mean, I'm always like there are a number of people here who are always looking. They're just experiencing new work, and they're keeping track of who's doing what, and they're buying zines, and they're buying self-published comics, and they're keeping track of what's on Instagram and so on. And I'm doing that to some extent. So there are a number of ways. I mean, either we approach the artist, because someone in my office, it's usually Eric. Jack brought a couple of great artists to us. Jack brought Simon to us, and to herself. And let me see. I mean, and several other people in my office will just put work in front of my face and say, I think you should look at this. We're publishing a book next year that my son, my son basically discovered, a collection by a cartoonist named Lizzie Stewart. So I have people younger than me watching this, and then there's then there are my books, and they're my books, they're Eric's books, and then there are books that a few other people in our office bring in. But it's a combination of submissions. Sometimes we'll get agented submissions. My favorite thing is Monsters was agented, and it was one of those Love and Rockets moments. It was like I got it in, and we get submissions from agents all the time, and every agent will tell you this is the greatest work you've ever done.
Of course,
so well, and so I'm really jaded. I mean, I open these things up with great skepticism, and so I opened up Emil's book. I mean, she sent me about a dozen pages, and I looked at them, and they were like, good. And I wrote back, but I thought, well, these could be like the 10 best pages in the book, right? So I said, well, send me the whole book. This is very good stuff, and I'll like to read it. So then I printed it out, I took it home, and I just started reading it, and it was like, holy shit! It's like, who is this person? Where did this person come from? I mean, you just don't see stuff like that. But that was agented, and a number of books we publish are agented. So I don't know what, like maybe at this point probably 20-25% of our books are agented. We published a book called The Structure is Rotten, Comrade, written and drawn by a European writer, European cartoonist. And that was just a cold submission. The writer just wrote to me, got my email address, and dropped me a line. And sometimes an artist will just get my email address and drop me a line and said, here's, I want you to read my book, and I'll open it up, I'll look at it, and I'm good enough at this, so I can look at a book and within about 10 seconds determine if I want to actually explore it and read the whole thing. And so I opened it up, started looking at it, and it was incredibly accomplished work. So I, read the whole thing, and we published that. So it can happen any number of ways. I mean, it's a lot more complicated today than it was, Got to keep track of what's going on.
I often think a lot of where we are today as cartoonists traces back to Love and Rockets 1. Is that something that you saw like through the 80s of, say, submissions and quality of work just increasing exponentially after that book is published?
Yeah, I did. I mean, the 80s was a big, you know what the 80s was like, sort of. Yeah, I mean, there were so many artists that came up and there was a real explosion of cartoonists in the 80s. I mean, there were the standout cartoonists, the Bros, and I think Pete and Dan. I think Chester Brown started around 88.
86, I think, was the first Vortex collection. So
yeah, that makes sense, right? So there was an explosion, and there were a lot of cartoonists who started publishing in the 80s who showed promise but didn't really go anywhere, or just petered out, or maybe they didn't have promise, But there was an explosion of independent cartoonists who were doing interesting work that reflected their sensibility, and there was an explosion of that. I mean, I think you could say that started with the Undergrounds, but then it was rejuvenated in the 80s, maybe with Love and Rockets, maybe with Raw, maybe with Weirdo. All of this stuff was bubbling up at that time.
And maybe with the direct market itself, right? I mean, that distribution channel allowed smaller, more personal work to exist.
Yes, it was much more open because they hadn't been colonized by Marvel and DC at that point. That was about to happen, but it hadn't happened. So that retailers would look at Love and Rockets and they would treat it the same as a Marvel or DC comic. It would just be another comic to order, a new comic, and that ended probably as early as the mid to late 80s. That attitude where, well, there was the black and white, boom, and that I think that killed a lot of interest among retailers on black and white comics at all. And most of their interest was probably bogus to begin with. And a lot of retailers didn't know any better. I mean, a lot of retailers, who otherwise wouldn't have, were stocking Love and Rockets or Neat Stuff, who just didn't know any better. They were actually including something good by accident.
That's such a funny description.
Like a lot of those shops that would sort of come and go. It really was like the kind of serial entrepreneur people who just, there's money in comics, we'll have a comic book shop, and they are looking for the next Ninja Turtles #1 or whatever, so they'll grab any oddball thing that they have. Broken clock has to be right 2 times a day, they say.
Yeah, right. I think there were. I think most comic shop owners actually love comics. It's just that they happen to like lousy comics, but they love them.
Well, then that might be different than the '90s speculator era because
it is. Yeah.
Because I got some of my comics. Gary, I got my comics at a bakery. You walk through the bakery where they have the dough and the donuts and all that. You go in this back, what probably was the broom closet the year before X-Men 1 comes out. And then you could get, your Extreme Studios books. They were not a comic shop. They did not have a diamond account the next year. But this is, in the area where I live, a town of about 7,000 people, there were 3 comic shops on the main street out there within 500 feet of one another. They didn't love comics.
What year would this be?
92, 93.
Okay. Yeah, I think you probably got a lot of people who saw the speculator boom. I thought they could get rich quick by opening a comic shop.
Or they had that real estate after the baseball card market fell apart and figured put some comics on the table.
Shops were selling comics on the side, and then they became comics stores.
Gary, how much editorial input did you have on things like Love and Rockets or Pete Bagg or Dan Clowes, these cartoonists in their early days? Was that part of your role?
Let me think. I would say approximately 0. Yeah, no. I mean, we had no editorial input. I'm trying desperately to think of something, some editorial advice I gave Jaime or Gilbert, but, and it's possible I talked to them about a panel, and very early on, because eventually it was just like, forget it, But I don't really remember anything. I mean, they represented my perception of the platonic ideal of a cartoonist, which is that they had this vision and they knew how to execute it. I didn't know how to execute it because it was too much their vision. And that's what I wanted comics to be. I didn't want to be fiddling with their comics. I didn't want to be saying, maybe you ought to beef up this character a little bit, a little thin on this one, because, Jaime was going to explore that character 3 years later. He had a plan. So I just thought it was so wholly their own. And I'm talking about, all the cartoonists we were publishing then. Joe Sacco, we started publishing him in 85, maybe. It just seemed ridiculous for me to impose any editorial guidance on cartoonists like that, because their writing, their drawing, their sensibility was all one. And, I would have to impose my outside sensibility on it. And I know that's big now. I know that, there are editors everywhere who are editing graphic novels, and I think maybe some artists need that. And I do talk to some artists who ask me, I asked when we publish a new artist, I ask them, how much do you want any input from me, or do you have this? And there are some artists who say, yeah, I'd like to send you, breakdowns, and I'd like to get some feedback, and I certainly do that.
That seems to be a model that would come out of, I'm going to say CCS, and I'm not sure exactly whether that's a model out of there, but certainly like my experience with traditional New York book publishers, they have this process that they want to see these steps, right? They want to see the breakdowns, all completed for editorial input and feedback, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I wonder how much that compromises when you think of somebody's vision like a Dan Clowes or, Hernandez brothers. I wonder if that vision can remain intact through that process.
Well,
because
here's my theory, that if an artist allows himself to undergo that process, then he doesn't have a fucking vision worth of shit anyway. Like a Dan Clowes or a Gilbert Hernandez wouldn't let themselves be moved around like that, and they wouldn't let themselves be edited, or at the very least they would push back, and eventually the relationship's not going to work. I was, and again, this goes back to everything is what you experience, right? But, all the film directors that I truly love, and this is outside the studio system, which is like a whole different question, but, someone like Roberto Rossellini or De Sica or Fellini, they didn't have people telling them, I want you to cut this out, and I want you to have more of Marcello Mastroianni over here. They were autonomous enough so that, and they had enough power for whatever reason that they could they could fulfill their vision. And then of course that became true in the 70s, American films, which is what I grew up on. Independent filmmaking came in just at the time when I was learning to appreciate film. So you had Carnal Knowledge, directed by Mike Nichols and written by Jules Feiffer. And I can't imagine any producer came in and told them, we want this change, we want that change. It just didn't happen. The Wild Bunch was Sam Peckinpah's fucking vision. And you either, accepted it or you didn't accept it. At that point, directors started getting, started achieving their own autonomy. For good and ill. There were probably a lot of absolutely dreadful films that were done, but you swim or swink. You swim or sink. You trust the director, and sometimes you'll get a Heaven's Gate, and sometimes you'll get a Wild Bunch. And that's what I was looking for in comics. That was the template I was looking for in comics, whether I knew it at the time or not. I was looking for a cartoonist with the vision, and the vision requires the ability to execute it, because an editor can help on occasion, but I really believe in the autonomy of the artist.
You mentioned filmmakers there, so I'm kind of curious. Heart of Darkness has come up. I know that's a book that you cherish.
Yeah, I do. All of Conrad, but yes.
Any thoughts on Apocalypse Now? Any reaction?
I like Apocalypse Now. He used Heart of Darkness and used it as a metaphor for Vietnam, so I don't see it as an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, and it's not that. But I liked it. When I saw it in New York. It came out in '79, and I saw it at the Ziegfeld Theater in Manhattan, because I was living in Connecticut at the time. And this was like the biggest theater in Manhattan. They had like scents around. They had speakers in the back, so it was like quadraphonic. So holy shit! You heard these helicopters going over your head, and then explosions behind you. And I thought, in one way, it's a complete fucking mess. It's like the last 20 minutes. What the fuck is going on? But and Brando. What Brando's doing there. Because I don't think Brando knew what he was doing there. But it's just so masterful. So much of it is so masterful, and clearly the obsessive vision of Coppola. So I liked it a lot. I liked it a lot irrespective of its flaws, and I'm perfectly concede its flaws.
What are some of the current Gary Groth books that you're quote unquote editing?
Let me see. Well, I do. Well, okay. One book I'm editing is a book that's not going to be out until next year. Yeah, and editing is always in quotes with me. It's a book called Red Rock Baby Candy by an artist named Shira Spector, and this was agented. So it kind of came in over the transom, and this is an amazing book. And again, it's the kind of book that requires no editing. I mean, I'm giving her, I am giving her some what could be considered editorial feedback, but it's really just refining everything she has there. It's a 206-page book. It's about she's a 50-year-old artist right now, and it's about her trying to become fertile, trying to have a child, during the time when her father contracts cancer and is going through that whole process, and eventually dies, and her trying to become fertile, and then her adopting a child. So it's an autobiographical book, so it's a great subject. But what I love about it is the way it's told. I don't even know if I could do justice to it, but virtually, she uses panels occasionally, but most of her pages are these collages in which there is a central image, and surrounding the central image are numerous other images that integrate seamlessly with the central image and that tell the story in somehow miraculously a perfectly linear way, where the lettering is integrated with the art. I've literally never seen anything like it.
Wow, that sounds exciting.
It really
I had
does.
the same feeling when I saw this as I had when I saw Emil's book. It's like, I've never quite seen images and words used in this way. It's like she invented, a new formal way of advancing the language of comics. So that's what's thrilling about this, to me.
Is this her first comic?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
How does that happen? I don't know how it happens, but it's like a miracle like that makes this worthwhile. And the drawing is fucking impeccable. And it's not only and the draftsmanship is not only amazing, but her imagination is just brilliant. I mean, you've never seen a succession of 200 images like this before.
Shira Spector.
Shira Spector.
How do you spell the Spector? Yeah, is it O-R or R-E?
O-R.
Yeah, we're going to be searching that art out.
Yeah, so another book I'm very excited about is by a cartoonist named Lee Lai. The title is Stone Fruit. And this is almost the opposite. This is a very traditional comics, in a very traditional comics format. It's a very contemporary story about a couple of friends in a couple of trans friends navigating their world, their families, and that's all it's about. And it is so beautifully told and so moving. And she uses the language of comics so impeccably. I mean, I don't know how, I don't know how, how she did this without doing this for 20 years. But as far as I know, this is her first, significant work. Maybe she did some earlier, smaller comics. But she uses the, conventional language of comics so brilliantly. And she has a great visual metaphor where her characters, when they are, when the two antagonists, girls, and their one of their daughters is with them, and they're outside playing. They turn into visually they turn into beasts because they're much freer when they're outside, walking through the woods and playing, and they're not constricted in a social milieu where they're where they have to deal with their status, and there's a freedom out there. And so and she just uses this technique beautifully and subtly. So that's another book we're working on that's going to be published next year. So that's the kind of stuff that I love. I acquire a lot of books that I give to other people in my office, other editors to edit, because I don't have the time to edit.
Yeah, both of those sound wonderful.
Taking notes.
I saw a book pop up, I think, on an Amazon listing from Fantagraphics out next year. Barry Windsor Smith's Monster.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that? I'm a huge Windsor. I love his work, and new work is welcome in my house.
If you're a big Windsor Smith fan, this is gonna knock you on your ass. It's unfucking believable. Barry's been working on this for over 30 years. You probably know the genesis of it. It started as a 20-page Hulk story or something like that. And my understanding, I'm not sure if Barry told me this, he told me a long time ago, so I don't know how I got this information. But my understanding is that Barry took it to Marvel, showed him the story, and that someone at Marvel said, well, can you change this and this and this and this and this? And Barry basically said, no, fuck you. I'm not changing anything. This is a story I want to tell. And he took it back, and he'd only done, 12 pages or 15 pages. I'm making that up. Maybe, I'm not sure. But he didn't do very much of it. I don't want to be too inaccurate here. But so he took it home, and he completely reconfigured it. And he's been working on it on and off for the last 30 or so years. And he finally finished it, like 4 or 5 months ago. And it's 360 pages.
Wow.
I wouldn't hesitate to say it is the most accomplished thing he's ever done. Now, when I told him, I consider this your magnum opus, he kind of rejected that by implying that he wants to do something even better.
That's an artist. That's an artist talking.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, this is, and it's a story. I wrote the catalog copy for it for our book catalog, and to distill this down to a couple of paragraphs in 280 words was so fucking hard because there is so much going on in the story. It has to do with Nazi eugenics, has to do with World War II. It's a family drama. It's a military thriller, and he just combined and then at the last like 50 pages of it, it turns into this metaphysical journey. There is I would say a 30-page section in it. Just to give you a little teaser, there's a 30-page section in it where these American GIs are discovering this eugenics lab in Nazi Germany at the end of the war, I guess when they enter Berlin. And it's literally 30 or 40 pages long, and it's one of the most intense passages in comics I've ever read. And it's slow. It's like these soldiers are moving through these rooms and finding all this horrible shit, and then other things happen, someone's alive. And it just moves really slowly, but it's absolutely mesmerizing. I mean, you're just and it's an amazing feat. Because I can't remember reading something quite like that. Because I mean, you see that kind of thing in film, but and the drawing is, I think the drawing is the best drawing he's ever done.
It is so great to hear all of that because, it seems like I have heard that he wasn't doing well health-wise or eyesight-wise or something. So it's incredible, it's great to hear that he's producing this level of work. Yeah, I mean, to me, that's a sign of you have to be a certain amount of healthy.
He was having some problems, but I think that's why it took so long. But he finished it to his satisfaction. And, and that means a lot. I mean, his satisfaction is about as fucking, high as you get. He holds himself to a high standard.
Guys who have been around for as long as he has in the comic game, a lot of them they don't know heads or tails about how to use a scanner or anything like that. Did he have to send those artboards to you guys to scan?
John Cook scanned it for him.
John B. Cook?
Yeah, who
Dig.
lives not far from him. And apparently, I think John drove over there, maybe brought a scanner, and scanned it all. And he scanned it to our specs.
2 questions, Gary.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
We're going to end on high notes. Fun
These are
notes.
always questions you don't want to ask at the beginning because the person's bad on you.
The yes ladder, man. Ask a bunch of small things to get that little yes, then go in for the hard sell. Here we go. Prisoner of Hate Island. Hate number 1, Peter Bagg. It's Kim Thompson. It's Gary Groth. It's Peter Bagg on a desert island, blowing up a toilet with some sort of dynamite is a part of it. And I hung out with Pete Bagg. He said that's based on a true story.
Oh,
Not the island part. So please elaborate.
That's a true story. Well, I think it was the first year we moved to here to Seattle, which would have been '89. I think it was the first year. And we started having a New Year's party every year, and we had it for a bunch of years. So I wanted to do something. It might have been the following year. It might have been 1990, but we had a great party. I have a big house, and there were always lots of people living in it at that time, and so I had a big New Year's party, and I wanted to do something spectacular. So you can go out to the Indian reservations, and you can buy dynamite along with your fireworks during 4th of July. You could go to Indian reservations, and you'd have to go, and there's like 60 or 70 booths at these Indian reservations, and they're all selling fireworks. And you have to go up and say, and Sado Voice, you have to say, do you have anything stronger than this? You'll say, are you a cop? And you go, no. And they'll bring out stuff. So I would buy like quarter sticks of dynamite. And so what I wanted to do that New Year's is to on the stroke of midnight, blow up a toilet. So next to my house, there's a small apple orchard. So I got a toilet somewhere, and several of us hauled the toilet up to this apple orchard away from the house, and we put it upside down. Yeah, we had to put it upside down, I think. And so everybody's like trooping up there, to hide behind trees and bushes to watch this thing go. And Jim Woodring actually filmed it. But the problem is that Jim started the filming as we were bringing the toilet up and as everyone was hiding and didn't know it was filming. And then he hit the button, thinking he was filming when we were going to blow it up, and he hit the stop button instead. So we have everything leading up to it.
It's a tragedy.
So anyway, somebody, so I got the quarter stick of dynamite. Somebody was supposed to hold the toilet, and I was going to light it, throw it under, and then drop the toilet. Right? So you have the full weight of the porcelain toilet that it could blow up. Because if you just had the toilet, it would just blow the seat off or something. It would be anticlimactic. So we figured that out. So anyway, we did that. The fucking thing blew, and I swear to God, what I saw was that a toilet was there 1 second, and there was no toilet there the next second. It was just not there. I did not literally see it explode. It was just vanished. And then, like, everyone is just kind of riveted, right? Standing there, like. And then literally about 60 seconds later, all over my neighborhood, you heard this showering, tinkling sound on rooftops. My neighbors have gotten used to me, but
I blew a VCR up like that once, and it was a straight 15 seconds of just gizmos and wires and nuts and bolts falling down on our heads, man. Like, I was getting traumatized. I wanted it to stop, man. I'm just like, please quit. One more story, Gary. Were you in the office? This is shouts to the late great Tom Spurgeon, who gave me just a little piece of this story, and I'm not sure if you were there, if you could corroborate, but the great Tom Spurgeon told me about being in the Amazing Heroes. We'll call it offices. It's still just Fantagraphics. It's not like a special wing or floor or anything like that. But he was there when Mark Waid threw a typewriter or something. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Spurge wasn't there because this happened in L.A.
Spurge.
And, well, I don't know if I should tell this.
If you don't think you should, then you definitely should.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell it if I have the right to excise it upon, reflection.
That's fair, but I'm going to keep this part right here, Ben, just to make everybody else mad.
Okay. Well, this was the oddest thing. Mark Waid worked for us. He edited Amazing Heroes for about a year. And this was in our LA office. And at that time, we still worked out of a house. So the way the house was laid out is the living room was nothing but a big open office space. And there were about 5 or 6 desks in there. Joe Sacco worked there. He was writing news in that room. And then, we had, someone was in charge of marketing. We had R. Fiore was working in that room. Then there was a room that was an offshoot to it, and it must have been an office when the house was built. And I worked there, probably with Tom Heinches, who was co-editing the Comics Journal with me at the time. And so that was kind of a long submarine-shaped room. So I was kind of off the main room, and it was perceived more as the journal office. And Mark had a desk out in the main living room. Now, I would get to the office around noon every day. I would work late, and I would get in late, but everyone else, would get in by 9 or 10 or something, but I was always getting in at noon, so I almost never was there earlier than that. But this one morning, I was there all night. I must have pulled an all-nighter or something, because I probably wouldn't have gotten up and gotten there early. So anyway, I was there when everyone was coming in, and which was unusual. So it's like 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting at my desk, and suddenly I hear this screaming going on outside my office, in the living room office. And I just hear this screaming, motherfuckers, motherfuckers. And I'm like, holy shit. And then I hear something slamming down. It was sort of this, implied violence. So I run out, and what I see is Mark sitting on the floor on his knees, smashing the phone on the floor repeatedly and screaming. And then I look all around me, and nobody's doing anything. I mean, everyone's just working, as if this is not happening. So, it's like surreal. And I don't know what the fuck's going on. So I walk up to him and say, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he looks up at me, and he just pulls himself together, and kind of gets the phone back up and puts it on the desk and sits back and, kind of mumbles or something. And then I look around, everyone's just typing away. So I go back into my office, and I was like, what the fuck was that about? And it had to do with his car at the mechanics. Like, the mechanic gave him bad news about his car or something. And I was like, well, I forget what I said after that, but it was, all right. So I went back into my office, and then later on, I guess maybe during lunch, Mark had left, and I walked back into the office, and I said, "Hey," did anyone else see that? Like, what the fuck is going on? Didn't you all see that? And everyone said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why didn't you react?" I mean, that was like nuts. And everyone said, "Well, he does that all the time." But he only does it before you get here.
Here's my only disappointment. I'm just upset that that wasn't in reaction to, like, Flash's treatment in Crisis on Infinite Earths or some bullshit like that.
That would have been justified.
Oh man, that's so good, dude.
I mean, to this day, I don't really understand. I guess I don't understand what was going on in the office before I got there. But But yeah, everyone said, well, that's kind of routine. Doesn't we don't even notice it anymore. And he went on to DC to become a superstar. So.
Yep. Jimmy, do you have anything?
I can't top that.
The thing is, Gary, truthfully, we have a million things, and we could talk to you for hours upon hours, man. But you have business to attend to. I'm so happy.
I was going to send you a list of people and things we could talk about. So maybe another time.
I mean, let's do it again. I'm so happy to talk to you, especially when I saw the piece on Comics Journal talking about that you recovered from this nonsense. It was so crucial to say hi.
I mean, there's no telling what can happen.
It's so crucial to say hi. I don't know next time I'm going to travel and go to a con, man. So this is us hanging out right here, man. I don't know when I'm going to be at SPX or whatever. So let's do it again. The Fantagraphics oral history. It's called Comics as Art. It's called We Told You So. Comics as Art, and it was Gary Groth, man, who put his money where his mouth was, and sort of created a situation, created a house, and we get to walk in the door, man. So,
well said.
Can't have more reverence for anybody than we do for you, Gary. Such a pleasure, and thanks for hanging out with us for a little bit.
No reverence, just a little respect. That's all.
Lots of respect, man. Boatloads of motherfucking respect. And in your honor,
I'm
going to blow up a toilet.
Do it. Satisfying.